Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura Matthews, and I'm the Cos Cob Library branch manager. We're very excited to have Deborah Goodrich Royce here today to talk about her newest book, Ruby Falls, published by Post Hill Press and distributed by Simon & Schuster. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Deborah Goodrich Royce's first psychological thriller, Finding Mrs. Ford, was published in 2019 to rave reviews. Her second, Ruby Falls, was just released on May 4th. Deborah was an actress in film and television for 10 years. Her big break came with the role of Silver Kane, sister of the legendary Erica Kane on All My Children. Deborah went on to star in a number of feature films, television movies, and television series. After the birth of her daughters, Deborah moved to Paris in 1992 and worked as a reader for Le Studio Canal Plus. On her return to the US, she transitioned to Miramax Films as their story editor. Deborah and her husband have restored several historic properties and have completed a number of revitalization projects. In 2004, they restored and reopened the Avon Theater Film Center, a 1939 landmark in Stamford, Connecticut. In addition, Deborah serves on a number of governing boards, including ones for the Greenwich Historical Society and the Greenwich International Film Festival. Thank you for coming, Deborah. I enjoyed Ruby Falls immensely, and we're thrilled to have you here to speak about it.
It is a great pleasure, Laura. Thank you for having me.
Can you start off by telling us a little bit about Ruby Falls and what inspired you to write it?
I'd love to talk a little bit about that. So the inspiration for Ruby Falls, Ruby Falls came to me in a funny way. It kind of downloaded in my brain, the first two chapters, which was a very strange experience. I had finished my first book. It was out to publishers. I was considering writing another book, taking notes on a different book. And really the first two chapters, when this little girl is abandoned in a cave in a very traumatic incident, and the next chapter, when she grows up and marries a tall, dark stranger and decides not to tell him about what happened to her in her childhood, that appeared. From there, I did a lot of reflection and obviously several years of writing. Ruby Falls is inspired by Gothic thrillers, mainly Rebecca, but also books like Jane Eyre and The Woman in White. In the classic Gothic setup, you have a damsel in distress who does come under the influence of a man who may be malevolent, he may be benign. So that's the basic structure. And from Rebecca, it's not a rewrite, as you know, of that book, but it's a flight of fancy really taking off from that place. I'm also a huge fan of Hitchcock films. So those were all the inspirations weaving into this.
Thank you. The cover of the book is so beautiful and haunting. It really suits the story so well. Can you tell us a little bit about how it was chosen?
I would love to talk about the cover. This was an existing photograph or work of photographic art. I don't know if it's just a photograph. I think there's some better term, by an artist named Melanie Wilhide. She was doing a show in California when her computer was stolen. And when it was retrieved 3 weeks later, and she tried to get her work back, everything looked like that. I have a copy right here, and you can see the images. It's kind of broken in strips. So she was quite inspired by what happened. This photograph was not part of the works that were stolen. It was one that she created later, but it was inspired by that. And she did a whole show and dedicated it to the thief of her computer, because he'd given her in the end such an unexpectedly good idea. And I do think it fits the nature of the main character of Ruby Falls and the nature of the book very well.
Yeah, it really looks almost like it was meant to be the cover of the book, like it was made specifically for that with the roses. It's beautiful. It was such a fun book to read with great pacing and plenty of suspense. As I mentioned earlier, Ruby Falls is your second thriller following your debut novel, Finding Mrs. Ford. What drew you to the thriller genre?
So many things drew me to thriller. As an actress, I definitely had my share of thriller films and television shows that I appeared in. As a viewer, I've always loved a good thriller, and as a reader as well. I think what I'm most interested in the thriller category is the idea of identity, a character's identity, and what a character shows you and what a character doesn't show you. That intersection between what's revealed and what's concealed, it, for me, is the sweet spot. It's where I find a lot of interest. And that kind of peeling of the onion is what I like in a thriller. I don't like so much violence and gore, but I like that character element.
So as you're talking about, not everything is as it appears to be, what's your strategy for developing plot twists?
That's a really good question. So with Finding Mrs. Ford, my first book, which is a nonlinear story, and it's nonlinear twice. You have two time periods that play out to a crescendo, and then you go back and look at it a different way. That was very complicated for organizing all the twists and making sure that nothing was ever seen before or after it was meant to be seen, which involved massive timelines and charting, and at times even laying out the entire book on the floor, which, having dogs and cats, is not a smart thing to do. Physical pages I'm talking about. Ruby Falls follows a less challenging trajectory because you begin when she's a child and she's abandoned in the cave. You go to 20 years later, and with a few exceptions, you're moving generally in a linear fashion toward a conclusion. One of the things that I worked on heavily in Ruby Falls was because our character Ruby, as a little girl, was abandoned at a time which was in the 1960s. And as she grows up, she's trying very hard to figure out why her father would have done that. She becomes somewhat interested in conspiracies of the time, you know, the Kennedy assassination and what was going on with Cuba, or the KGB or the CIA, or something called the Dixie Mafia, which is a real thing. So that was kind of fun, researching all of those elements, because I didn't really know which thing I wanted it to be that caused her father to leave her in such a horrible way. And that was something that, as I went along doing the research, I made a decision of what I thought was really the only possible reason for her father to leave her there.
So as you were just mentioning, both your books delve into this theme of identity and people's secrets. Do you have anything else to add about what draws you to those topics?
Sure. I mean, one thing I remember when I was a young actress, I did a movie about the serial killer Ted Bundy, and the actor Mark Harmon played Ted Bundy. And I know later they did more of a documentary about him. And I played the woman who married Bundy. And that's sort of a point of reflection. You know, I did all the research. I read, there was a very famous book about Bundy at the time by a writer named Anne Rule called The Stranger Beside Me. And yeah, I thought about, why on earth would this young woman follow this psychopathic killer across the United States and marry him while he was on his final trial for a string of gruesome murders. And I can only believe that she didn't believe it. She had to have thought that that wasn't who he was. So what's up with that? What is that when a person has such close contact with another person and doesn't see at all what somebody else sees? I find it very intriguing.
Yeah, I mean, with the popularity of true crime, it seems to be something that people are really drawn to. So earlier we mentioned your success as an actress and a story editor. Can you tell us in what ways your previous endeavors have influenced your writing?
Well, acting in a funny way, is great preparation for writing, because in acting, all you think about is character and character motivation. I mean, it's 100% your focus. You are less focused on what makes sense in the story as you are in your character. So I do think it's very good preparation in that way, because you do want well-developed characters who make sense. My years at Miramax were extremely formative, and I think of those years really as my writing school, because working with some of the best and the brightest writers in the business in an editorial capacity, it gets you to sharpen your game and really think about why something works and why it doesn't. And just it's an act almost of naming something, which I think is a very good exercise in helping us understand something.
Thank you. Yeah, it must be interesting. Do you have you based any of your characters on like characters you've played, or have you based them on people you've met along the way, or are they just something you imagine?
Well, it's any and all of those things. Ruby, who grows up to be Eleanor Russell, is a soap opera actress. She does play the sister of a much more famous soap opera actress. And I played the sister of, I played Silver Kane, who was the sister of Erica Kane. And so sure, I played around with that. The character of Sylvia Long, the Susan Lucci, you know, homage in this book really bears no resemblance to her. I mean, it's all fiction, but I had a little bit of fun with that.
So when you're writing a thriller like this of so many twists and turns, you talked a little bit about how you organized it, but what were some other strategies you have for keeping on top of everything? Can you tell us a little bit more about your writing process? Do you do a lot of time planning, or do you like jump right in?
I do both. So with this book, I jumped right in because there was that initial download of the first 2 chapters, which was very odd and not my normal process. So I do a lot of research. I make a lot of notes. I structure timelines. Another thing I do in addition to my notes is I like to go online and print out old calendars, like, you know, the sort of not date a page, but month at a page calendars, because I'll write on those. Like, so here I was looking at, let's say, the year 1987, and I would print out several months of 1987 that were pertinent. And that helped me because I would make little notes. And there's something about that visual of seeing how many weeks was her movie in production, what it was pertinent for me, the longest night of the year when I wanted something to happen. And so all of those things, I make notes at night. I have a pad next to the bed. I scribble at night. Question, you know, is if I can see it the next day. I could read it if I've scribbled in the dark, but I do both at the same time, both the plotting and the writing.
Did you know what the ending was going to be before you wrote the story, or
No.
did it come later?
That came later. It took me some time to sort out where I thought was the most honest place for her to go.
So what was the idea that really sparked the writing of the book?
I have no idea. I really have no idea why those first 2 chapters came to me. I do know that I went to Ruby Falls as a child. I do know that it was a very frightening place to me. My memory is they did turn off the lights completely. I cannot even imagine in retrospect that they would do that. I mean, somebody would probably fall over or fall into the water. I can't remember how close the water was. I just remember being very frightened. And that one particular day several years ago, when it came to me of this child being abandoned in that cave in the dark, it just seemed like the scariest thing that could ever happen.
The book does have such an eerie atmosphere. Are there the other places in the book, places you have visited?
Yes, so I lived in Los Angeles when I was an actress, and about 5 years ago, one of my daughters moved to LA. And so I started going back to LA, and it was very emotional for me. I'd been gone a long time. I'd been an actress when I was there, and I quit acting when I left there. And the book is dedicated to 4 different friends of mine who died, people I was very close with in my Los Angeles years. And I think the book was a little bit triggered by this experience of going back to LA, which was very emotional. I've lived in Greenwich now for 20 years. So if I drive down the road and I see Balducci, I don't have an emotional experience of, oh my God, the last time I was there, I was with my friend who died, because I'm here now every day for 20 years. Going back to LA after that long hiatus, every place felt very fraught with emotional content. It was, I think my daughter thought I was a little nutty, because I would see, the place where I took them to the pediatrician, my children, or the place where I used to spend time with this girlfriend who died. And it took a while to kind of defuse the highly emotional content of LA. And I think that bleeds into the book a little bit.
Yes, I do too. It feels very familiar. I think your familiarity helps the reader really feel like they're there. Let's see. Did your writing process change at all between writing Mrs. Ford and writing Ruby Falls?
I think it just keeps getting more of a natural process in terms of structuring my time. When I started finding Mrs. Ford, I'd been writing secretly for a long time, but that was the point where I really started to develop a discipline. I have since cleared more and more of my schedule to enhance that discipline. So my process is similar. I'm finishing up a 3rd book now. It's similar really with all the books, but it just keeps becoming more natural.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I'd meant to ask you, why did you choose the 80s for your time frame? Was that when you were in LA?
I lived in LA from 1984 to 1992. I thought it was an incredible moment in time in Los Angeles. Everything just, well, probably because I was so young, it just felt so exciting and stimulating. I also chose that time period because of technology. I wanted her abandonment in the cave to happen at a time when there was really no technology to figure out what happened. I didn't want to have cameras everywhere. I didn't want to have credit card records or cell phones that could be traced. I also didn't want cell phones in the 80s, or with a character who's very much into conspiracies. I think if you do that now, you can go down a different rabbit hole, or many dark internet rabbit holes. And I didn't want it to be so consuming. Her fixation on what happened to her father is sort of restricted more to going to the library than, being up for days on end on her computer.
So in both your books, the past and present collide for the main character. What inspires you to approach their stories this way?
Well, I think that's a very interesting premise of the past catching up with someone. In Finding Mrs. Ford, the past catches up when somebody comes looking for her. In Ruby Falls, we have a girl who's having trouble shaking the memories of her past. In the 3rd book I'm working on, I'm writing about a writer who's obsessed with the murder of her mother's best friend. And that happened to my mother. Her best friend was murdered. So I've fictionalized, and that is an unsolved crime. I think it is a known thing. I mean, you talk about unsolved crimes and true crimes. You look at people like Dominic Dunn or Michelle McNamara, who was obsessed with the Golden State Killer. It's kind of a thing. People who have violence that occurs somewhat tangentially to them can become a little bit fixated on that in general. So that's kind of a through line for me, the past playing a large effect on the present.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting how you bring in these kind of autobiographical elements. I think it helps to really draw the reader in. So Mrs. Ford had her dogs and Ruby had her cat. There were a lot of times I was really nervous about the cat and Ruby Falls.
I
Do you
know.
have animals at home that inspired your furry characters?
Absolutely. I have two King Charles Spaniels who inspired the two dogs in Finding Mrs. Ford. My daughter Tess has two black cats who inspired Belle. Uh, and in the third book, there's a large standard poodle. The writer has a big dog. I grew up with a poodle. So yeah, I don't know if my characters are always going to have some sort of familiar who tags along with them, like Bell Book and Candle.
So Ruby Falls differed from Finding Mrs. Ford in that it was a first person narrative. What influenced your decision to go in that direction this time?
Well, I thought it was the only way to tell the story, really, to get as deeply into her head as I could. And you can do that with a close third person for sure. But I just thought it was more effective.
Yeah, I think so too. But was it difficult for you to switch?
No, no. And in the third book, I switch within the book. I have the writer who's obsessed with murder, and that is in the first person, almost like her writing her thoughts. And she is writing a thriller about a woman whose husband and children disappear in the middle of the pandemic last year. It all takes place in Florida in the pandemic. And that is in third person, close third. So I switch within the book. And in a way, with that, it helps to distinguish which character I'm writing.
Was it strange? Is it strange to be writing about like having your characters based in the pandemic?
It was not at all, because it felt like such a heavy cloak that was around us all. And I was in Florida when this all, the world closed down, whatever day that was. I think of it as March 13th. And I was there and I was on a book tour and the whole thing stopped. And I just kind of sat down where I was, the way that everybody did. And I started doing a lot of research into this murder, this real life murder of this girl in Pittsburgh. And that book started heavily with research before writing. And I decided I didn't want to write that nonfiction. I wanted to fictionalize it. That's just not my thing.
So for me, your books have a very cinematic feel. If there was a movie or a series, do you have someone you could imagine playing Ruby?
I would want a very timeless looking young actress. I think she cannot look too contemporary. I don't have such a fix on who all the 25, 30-year-old actresses are now, but somebody with a very ethereal, old-fashioned quality. For Mrs. Ford, there is an actress who is attached to it now. This just happened. I can't say who it is. We're not going public with that. Things can still go wrong along the way, but this would be for the more mature Mrs. Ford, not for the younger. And boy, that would be exciting if that all comes to pass.
That would be very exciting. What projects are you working on now, aside from your new book? Or do you want to tell us anything else about your new book?
Well, the new book right now is called Reef Road, which is the name of a street in Palm Beach, Florida. And I like the name because it sounds like a spooky place name, like kind of ships running aground. And the whole storyline of the young woman whose husband and children disappear, that takes place on a street called Reef Road. It's where they live. And Reef Road has a beach at the end of it, which is a famous surfing beach. It's called Reef Road Beach. And it is important to the story in many ways. And I love setting it in the pandemic. And the pandemic a year ago was completely different from the pandemic now. I mean, this was the moment in time where you didn't know if your Amazon packages were going to kill you. You didn't know if you had to Clorox all your fruit. There was such a feeling of things oozing under the door, the contagion. And I think it's a very fitting setting for a thriller. There are many aspects. Also, because of that level of confinement, I think it was particularly shocking to have someone disappear in the middle of it. So I liked writing about it, but not in just a nonfiction way, telling the story of the pandemic. I liked using it as a backdrop.
Do you have a personal connection to the setting of your third book as well?
Yeah, so that's where I was when this all happened. And
Oh, that is where you are. Okay.
So I ride my bike around and look at all these spots. I like to write places as they are. I like to name the place what it is. I like to make sure that if I say a street is a certain place, that you, the reader, could go there and figure it out.
And you also spent time in the setting for Finding Mrs. Ford as well, right?
Absolutely. That is set in Watch Hill, Rhode Island, which is 2 hours up the road from here, and in Detroit, Michigan, where I grew up.
Yeah, I like that, because then as a reader too, if you visited these places, you recognize different elements of the story. It's fun. So thank you, Deborah. This has been so much fun. I know when your next book comes out, we'll be eager to speak with you again. There are signed copies of Ruby Falls available for purchase through Diane's Books. You can contact them at 203-869-1515 or visit their website at dianesbooks.com. Authors Live is made possible through the support of the Greenwich Library, Board of Trustees, and contributions of generous donors. For more information, please visit greenwichlibrary.org/authorslive. Thank you again, Deborah. We're really looking forward to your next book.
Thank you, Laura. It's been a pleasure.